Good afternoon. Welcome to session 3, Novel Applications of Nutrient Data. I'm filling in for Mary LeMay, who could not make it. I will list the speakers. You'll have their presentations followed by a Q&A at the end, and enter your questions into the Q&A box during the talks as they come up to you. Our first speaker is Adrianne Griebel-Thompson, who's at the University of Kansas, and she will speak on dietary and supplemental iodine intake and urinary iodine concentration of pregnant women in the Midwestern United States. Majd Jauhary-Nayfeh is at Russell Sage College, and she will talk on simulating changes in sodium potassium within manufactured foods in the United States. Lauren O'Connor, who is with USDA ARS, will talk on estimated lean and non-lean Oz equivalents of red meat and poultry using the USDA Food Patents Equivalence Database. Julie Hess, who's also with USDA ARS, will talk on modeling dairy-free and vegan USDA food patents. So can we have the first presentation?
Thank you for having me. I will be discussing the results of a study which reports the first estimation of dietary iodine intake of pregnant women in the United States. As we had urine samples from these women, we are also able to discuss the iodine status of the population measured by urinary iodine concentration and grouped by World Health Organization subgroups, and compare this to intake. Before we get started, I want to disclose our funding and conflicts of interest. The study was funded in part by the National Institute of Health and the Office of Dietary Supplements. The authors have no conflicts of interest to report. Iodine is an essential micronutrient for thyroid function, and through thyroid function, fetal growth, development, and neurodevelopment. There are 3 stages of thyroid-dependent neurodevelopment. The first stage begins during the second half of the first trimester. This stage is dependent on maternal thyroxine, as the fetal thyroid cannot make thyroid hormones at this stage of pregnancy. During this stage, neuron proliferation and migration are the mechanisms of neurodevelopment occurring. The second stage is during the second trimester. At this point, the fetal thyroid can produce thyroid hormones, but not at a sufficient level, so maternal thyroid hormones are still important. The final stage is after birth. While hormone production increases with increasing gestation, the thyroid does not mature to producing adequate levels of thyroid hormone until after birth. Due to this, infants born early are at risk of transient hypothyroidism until the thyroid matures to a point where it can produce adequate thyroid hormones. I have identified the following research gaps. The dietary iodine intake of pregnant women in the United States is unknown, and an update on the supplemental iodine intake of pregnant women in the U.S. is needed. Finally, comparing total iodine intake from both diet and supplements to the marker of iodine status, which is urinary iodine concentration, is also needed. The reason that dietary iodine intake is unknown in the United States is that until June 2020, there was not a database containing the iodine content of common foods consumed in the United States. In June 2020, the database for the iodine content of common foods was published. This was a joint project between the USDA, the FDA, and the Office of Dietary Supplements of the National Institute of Health to compile a database which provides data on the iodine content of commonly consumed foods in the United States. Previously, little information on the amount of iodine consumed from foods in the U.S. was available, and the publication of this database will allow for the estimation of iodine intake in U.S. populations for the first time. The sea is a large reservoir for most of the iodine on the earth, so foods which come from the sea, such as fish, seaweed, and seafood, are good sources of iodine, though few Americans consume the 2 servings per day recommendation of the dietary guidelines for Americans. Iodine is also consumed in dairy and grain products, though the amount of iodine in these foods is highly variable and dependent on production practices. Finally, in the United States, iodized salt is available, but with increasing varieties of salt, many of which are not iodized, not all people are consuming iodized salt. These factors together suggest the possibility that many people in the U.S. are not consuming adequate iodine. and as iodine is essential to fetal brain development, knowing that iodine intake of pregnant women is needed to ensure optimal brain development of their children. Iodine status is determined by measuring the amount of iodine in the urine, termed urinary iodine concentration. Urinary iodine concentration is highly variable and dependent on recent intake of iodine. So to accurately estimate individual urinary iodine concentration, 10 or more samples taken at various time points on various days are needed. But to assess the status of a large population, like what was done in this study, random spot samples have been determined to be appropriate. The World Health Organization has created guidelines for assessing the iodine status of populations, and within these guidelines, they have made 4 subgroups of iodine status. These subgroups are insufficient, adequate, above requirements, and excessive. And as I said, these groups are created from the urinary iodine concentration of the participants of the population. And I also want to note that as these recommendations are for large populations, our study had 966 participants, and when we grouped them by these World Health Organization categories, there were 100 or more participants in each of the categories. Past studies have found pregnant women in the United States to have mild to moderate iodine deficiency, which was measured by urinary iodine concentration. The data I am reporting on this slide comes from 2 NHANES cycles. I also want to emphasize that these findings are from only urinary iodine concentration, as dietary iodine intake of U.S. populations is unknown. Our objective was to estimate iodine intake from diet and supplements in 966 pregnant women between 12 and 20 weeks gestation and compare to urinary iodine concentration using World Health Organization subgroups for iodine status in a large pregnancy cohort. I also want to take the time on this slide to note that while participants were recruited as early as 12 weeks gestation, none were enrolled before 14 weeks gestation, so all participants in this study were in their 2nd trimester of pregnancy. I measured urinary iodine concentration using the Sandel-Kolthoff reaction. Dietary intake was collected using the Diet History Questionnaire 2.0 in our English-speaking participants, or by multiple 24-hour recalls in Spanish-speaking participants. For the Diet History Questionnaire data, results that showed the participant consumed less than 1,075 calories or greater than 4,777 calories per day were determined to be unreliable and were not included in analysis. From the diet history, the USDA, FDA, and ODS NIH database for the iodine content of common foods was used to estimate iodine intake. Supplemental iodine intake was assessed by monthly interviews with participants, and statistical analysis included descriptive statistics, chi-square analysis, and logistic regression. We found that participants did not meet the estimated average requirement for iodine from diet alone, and few were taking the recommended level of iodine from supplements, which is 150 micrograms per day, and this recommendation is from the American Academy of Pediatrics, the American Thyroid Association, and the Endocrine Society. When dietary and supplemental iodine intake were combined, participants were meeting the estimated average requirement. Though even with median intake above the estimated average requirement, about half of the participants would have what is considered inadequate intake of iodine. Comparably, urinary iodine concentration was marginally adequate, meaning it was only slightly above the guidelines set by the World Health Organization. Specifically, 48% of participants had a urinary iodine concentration considered insufficient by World Health Organization guidelines. On this slide, there are 2 scatter plots. One represents iodine intake, the other represents urinary iodine concentration. There is a line on each scatter plot which represents the recommendation for each. So on the iodine intake plot, the line represents the estimated average requirement, and on the urinary iodine concentration plot, the line represents the World Health Organization recommendation. 45% of participants fall below the dietary intake recommendations, and 48% fall below the recommendations for urinary iodine concentration. I would now like to bring your attention to the iodine intake plot and these 8 outliers that can be seen. And I'm going to discuss these outliers and give you some details about them. Median total iodine intake of the whole cohort was 188 micrograms per day, but in these 8 outliers, median intake was 3,037 micrograms per day. Median urinary iodine concentration was also higher than the whole cohort at 186 micrograms per liter. We were also interested to see if these outliers were affecting our calculation of the median at all. So we calculated the median excluding them and including them, and we found that they were very similar. When excluding the outliers, the median dietary intake of iodine was 108 micrograms per day, and when including them, it was 109 micrograms per day. And while the urinary iodine concentration of these outliers is elevated above the whole cohort, we believe this does not fully explain the increase in intake of these participants. After reviewing the diet history, the high intake may be due to over-reporting of milk consumption on the DHQ of these participants, with an average of 1,719 grams per day of milk consumption reported. And I also want to emphasize here that all 8 of these outliers, the diet history collection method was the Diet History Questionnaire 2.0. Another explanation is the database for the iodine content of common foods could possibly overestimate the amount of iodine in milk, leading to this increase in iodine intake. And finally, it is possible that both of these reasons together could be contributing to this finding. To determine if consuming supplemental iodine influenced iodine status, we completed a chi-square analysis. Findings from this analysis show that taking a supplement with iodine decreases the proportion of participants with a urinary iodine concentration considered insufficient. For this analysis, we divided the group based on the World Health Organization subgroups, so insufficient, adequate, above requirements, and excessive, and compared by demographic factors. For this analysis, the reference group was the adequate group. So all of participants were compared to those in the adequate group. And also I want to note on this slide, we only are presenting the results comparing the insufficient group to the adequate group due to size constriction on the slide. Participants enrolled at both Ohio sites and those with a pre-pregnancy BMI considered underweight had higher odds of belonging to the insufficient group compared to the adequate group. Spanish-speaking participants, those who reported their race or ethnicity of being Hispanic or Latina, and those who have a household income of less than $50,000 per year had lower odds of belonging to the insufficient compared to the adequate group. This analysis was a multivariable adjusted logistic regression model similar to the previous model, but instead of being divided based on those 4 World Health Organization subgroups, we divided the group into 2 groups based on urinary iodine concentration, a insufficient group with a urinary iodine concentration below 150 micrograms per liter, and a sufficient group with urinary iodine concentration above 150 micrograms per liter. Only 2 variables, study site and pre-pregnancy BMI, were significantly associated with iodine status group. Participants enrolled at either Ohio site had higher odds of belonging to the insufficient compared to adequate group. And odds of insufficient urinary iodine concentration compared to adequate urinary iodine concentration increased with increasing pre-pregnancy BMI. A few explanations for these findings are as follows. There were demographic differences between the sites. All of our Spanish-speaking and most of the Hispanic Latina participants were enrolled at the University of Kansas Medical Center. These are traits related to better iodine status, which may be able to explain the difference based on site. As for pre-pregnancy body mass index, there was no difference between BMI groups based on dietary and total iodine intake, but there was a difference based on supplemental iodine intake, with those in the underweight pre-pregnancy BMI group having the lowest intake of supplemental iodine. In summary, the prevalence of inadequate intake of iodine was 45%, which is supported by insufficient urinary iodine concentration in 48% of the cohort. Even in those with intake above the estimated average requirement, 45% had insufficient urinary iodine concentration. Use of a supplement containing iodine can ensure adequate intake and adequate status. Finally, the proportion of participants with low iodine intake was similar to the proportion with inadequate status, confirming the utility of the new database for the iodine content of common foods. As with any study, there were strengths and limitations to this work. I will begin with going over some strengths. This study recruited a large and diverse sample, which is a strength. We also used validated methodology to assess all of the data points we were interested in, including the Sandel-Kolthoff reaction to measure urinary iodine concentration. This project is highly innovative as it is the first to estimate dietary iodine intake in the United States. Use of spot samples is a strength of this study. And while spot samples are not appropriate to assess individual iodine status, they are appropriate to assess iodine status of large populations, which was done in this study. And we also grouped the participants based on the World Health Organization subgroups, which is also a strength. And finally, having an estimate of both intake and a biological marker of iodine is a strength of this study. When intake and the biological marker align like they did in this study, it increases the confidence of the results. As for limitations, the Diet History Question 2.0 does not capture data on iodized salt intake, and the 24-hour recall data did not specify, so we decided to make the assumption that salt was not iodized. A second limitation is that all of the participants in this study are from the Midwestern US, which is a region known for low fish consumption, and fish is a good source of iodine, so there is a possibility that the Midwestern US population is different than other regions of the country. This is the first study to estimate dietary iodine intake in a large pregnancy cohort. Both iodine intake and urinary iodine concentration suggest that iodine intake is inadequate in about half of the cohort. Iodine supplementation decreases the proportion of participants with insufficient urinary iodine concentration, though few took the recommended level of supplemental iodine. Before we end, I would like to thank my mentors and co-authors, the ADORE participants, and the researchers who were part of the ADORE study team. Thank you so much. And with that, I will end my presentation and thank you for your time and look forward to your questions.
Good afternoon. My name is Majd Jauhary-Nayfeh, and I'm currently a master's degree student at Russell Sage College for their Applied Nutrition program. In my talk today, I will discuss sodium and potassium within manufactured foods as part of the US diet, and how by simulating little changes, we can accelerate progress to achieve better health outcomes. Within the US, manufactured foods contribute around 70% of our average daily energy intake. Therefore, drastic dietary changes on a national scope are unrealistic, especially in a short period of time. But by approaching US food manufacturers to do some adjustments, we can achieve a larger and a more efficient impact on public health than what we would have been able to if our focus was only on individual dietary changes. I will first discuss sodium, potassium, and iodine, as they are three of the major nutrients that contribute to the body's physiological homeostasis. Sodium's consumption averaged 3,397 milligrams per day within the U.S. population of those who are 1 year and over. This exceeds the dietary guidelines for Americans, the DGA's recommendations of 2,300 milligrams per day for those who are 9 years and up. And most health professionals are aware that elevated sodium levels can lead to high blood pressure and increased risk for cardiovascular disease. When we track down where most of the dietary sodium in our diet is coming from, according to the USDA's dietary guidelines for Americans for the years 2020 to the year 2025, commercially manufactured food, including restaurants, are the biggest culprits. Now, the FDA did put out voluntary sodium reduction goals for manufacturers in hopes to reduce sodium levels offered in foods. And for a food to qualify for the reduced sodium claim, a minimum of 25% less sodium than the regular reference food is needed. For example, if a manufacturer wants to include the phrase reduced sodium on the label of a can of chicken noodle soup, this can of soup needs to contain at least 25% less sodium than the original chicken noodle soup made by the same manufacturer. It is also important to note that the current FDA's sodium guidelines are 3,000 milligrams per day. This slide represents the percentage population that is within the current sodium guidelines in darker green versus the percentage of those exceeding the sodium recommendations in lime green. So for ages 2 to 4, 97% of males exceeded the guidelines and 95% of females exceeded the guidelines. In the age group of 5 to 8, 97% of males exceeded the guidelines versus 97% of females exceeding the guidelines. For ages 9 to 13, 97% of males exceeded the guidelines versus 96% of females. For ages 14 to 18, it was 97% for males, 77% for females. Ages 19 to 30, it was 97% for males versus 84% of females. Ages 31 to 59, 97% of males versus 82% of females. And for those who are 60 and over, 94% of males exceeded the dietary guidelines for sodium versus 72% of females exceeding the dietary guidelines, demonstrating that there is a big gap between the dietary recommendations of sodium and the amount of intake across all age groups. Potassium is another extremely important element for the human body and its functions. Potassium's consumption averaged 2,497 milligrams per day within the U.S. population of 1 year and over, falling short of the DGA's recommendations of 2,600 milligrams per day for adult females and 3,400 milligrams per day for adult males. Recent studies have emphasized the importance of the sodium to potassium ratio and its association with blood pressure, where the urinary sodium to potassium ratio levels had significant positive relation to systolic blood pressure. Now, when researching the association between sodium and potassium and blood pressure, even a small sodium intake can be detected as a risk factor for increasing blood pressure if potassium intake was minimal. So these findings were independent of both sodium and potassium levels, suggesting that the sodium to potassium ratio plays a larger role in blood pressure control than the amount of intake for both elements. Although iodine is not our focus for the study, it is worthy to note the importance of using iodine-fortified salts in manufactured foods, because iodine deficiency disease have been resurfacing within the US and globally, partly due to the decrease in iodine-fortified salt consumption. And although the general US population is considered iodine sufficient, the US dietary iodine intakes have drastically declined since the 1970s, especially within vulnerable groups such as women of reproductive age. Moving on to research methodology, my main focus was how to reduce sodium intake and increase potassium intake while hopefully not making it extremely cumbersome for the food industry, nor create severe changes in flavor for consumers. Therefore, simulating 25% reduction in sodium and 25% increase in potassium made sense when considering the FDA's recommendations to manufacturers of what can be considered a product with reduced sodium, which I have discussed earlier. SAS 9.4 was used for statistical simulations. The key categories of products where shifts were implemented were deli meat sandwiches, soups, and savory snacks. These categories were chosen based on the following factors. First, there were 3 of the top 10 contributors to sodium consumption in the American diet. And second, deli meat sandwiches and savory snacks were 2 of the top 10 contributors to potassium in the American diet. And soups, although they do contain a good amount of potassium, they were not within the top 10 contributors. This slide was adapted from the What We Eat in America analysis of the enhanced data for the years of 2013 to 2016. Sandwiches came in first at 21% as the largest contributor to sodium consumption within the American diet. The sandwiches category included bread and anything that went in a typical sandwich. Examples were hot dog sandwiches, breakfast sandwiches, deli sandwiches, peanut butter sandwiches, burritos and tacos, etc. Soups and snacks both contributed 4% each to the American sodium consumption. For our data on sodium and potassium intake amounts, we utilized the enhanced 24-hour recall data for the years 2017-2018. For analysis purposes, age groups were separated into 6 different categories: 2 to 5-year-olds, 6 to 11-year-olds, 12 to 19-year-olds, 20 to 39-year-olds, 40 to 59-year-olds, and those who are 60 years and over. Arriving to our results. For the sodium consumption, overall, on average, 2-year-olds and over consumed 3,389 milligrams per day. With our 25% reduction, the number went down to 3,244 milligrams per day. For 2 to 5-year-olds, the mean sodium consumption was 2,171 milligrams per day, went down after our simulation to 2,073. For 6 to 11-year-olds, it went from 2,899 to 2,760. 12 to 19-year-olds went from 3,320 milligrams per day to 3,167. 20 to 39-year-olds went from 3,759 to 3,610. 40 to 59-year-olds went from 3,549 to 3,413 milligrams per day. And for those who were 60 and over, the mean sodium consumption was 3,227 milligrams per day, and after the simulation went to 3,073 milligrams per day. As evident by these numbers, the age category with the highest sodium consumption was the 20 to 39-year-olds. For the mean potassium consumption overall and on average, for those 2 years and over, consumption was at 2496 milligrams per day. And after our increase of 25% more of potassium in the discussed 3 food groups, the consumption went up to 2559 milligrams per day on average. For the 2 to 5-year-olds, it went up from 1997 milligrams per day to 2032. For the 6 to 11-year-olds, it went from 2089 to 2144. For the 12 to 19-year-olds, it went from 2169 milligrams per day to 2230. For the 20 to 39-year-olds, it went from 2562 to 2631. For the 40 to 59-year-olds, it went from 2675 milligrams per day to 2738. And for the 60 and over, the consumption went up from 2619 milligrams per day to 2686 milligrams per day of potassium. The age category with the highest consumption of potassium was the 40 to 59-year-olds. To analyze the data, after the simulations, there was an overall decrease in sodium consumption of 3.8 to 4.7%. And there was an overall increase in potassium consumption of 1.8 to 2.8%, depending on the category. As for the sodium to potassium ratio, there was an overall reduction of 6 to 7.3%. The greatest sodium reduction was among the 60-plus-year-olds, and the largest potassium increase was among the 20 to 39-year-olds. Currently, there is no established ideal sodium to potassium intake ratio. But when looking at the DGA's recommendations for adults, which was 2,300 milligrams per day of intake of sodium, and for potassium was 2,600 milligrams per day for adult females and 3,400 milligrams per day for adult males. Creating a ratio out of these numbers provides us with a sodium to potassium ratio of 0.88% for females and 0.68% for males. If we look at the sodium to potassium ratios in our investigation, we can notice an apparent decline after adjusting for 25% changes, but there is still room for improvement. This table here shows the exact numbers, but as I mentioned in the previous slide, overall reduction in sodium to potassium ratio was between 6 to 7.3%. To conclude my presentation, slight changes to only 3 categories made a measurable impact. By extending our methodology to a broader set of products, we can achieve considerably improved health goals. I'm including my references here. Please feel free to contact me with any requests if you would like to look for any references. I will include my email address at the end of the slide.
Hi everyone, my name is Lauren O'Connor and I'm a scientist at the USDA's Beltsville Human Nutrition Research Center. And today I'll be presenting on a method that I developed to estimate lean and non-lean ounce equivalents of red meat, poultry, and cured meat using the USDA's Food Pattern Equivalence database. And I did this in collaboration with Kelly Higgins at USDA and Kirsten Herrick at NCI. I've spent a good portion of my career so far focusing on how meat variables are described and defined in the scientific literature. And a lot of this work was motivated by statements made in the 2015 scientific report of the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee, which was then reiterated in the 2020 report. Both reports comment on how variability in food group terminology makes it difficult to compare studies during evidence synthesis, and that the terminology about meat food groups in particular, was the most troublesome, and that this is important and needed work for future dietary pattern research and food pattern modeling. In an effort to quantify this concern, myself and colleagues from Purdue and Colorado State University completed a systematic review in which we surveyed over 3,000 articles that assessed either an association between or an effect of meat consumption on a nutrition-related chronic disease outcome. And we extracted the metadata of how the meat group of interest was named and described by the researchers in the published articles. And we noticed a theme that there are 4 or 5 ways that you'll see red meat described in the literature. And when I use the term red meat, I'm referring to beef, pork, lamb, and some other mammalian game meats. But the term I have in quotes there, quote unquote, red meat, can be operationalized in several different ways in the literature. So then when I was a fellow at the National Cancer Institute, I applied these 4 different methods of defining the term red meat using NHANES data to see if how the red meat variables were operationalized would make a meaningful difference in population level intake estimates. And on the graph to the right, you'll see that we mapped the intake of the 4 different methods compared to the allotment ranges from the Dietary Guidelines for Americans recommended eating patterns. And so the gray bar in the background is the allotted amount from those healthy eating patterns. And the point estimates are quote unquote red meat from each of the methods described in the table. And as you can see, depending on how red meat is operationalized, can have a meaningful effect on red meat intake estimates at the population level. So if we describe red meat to be just unprocessed red meat, like in method 1, almost all age and sex categories are below the allotted amounts recommended in the dietary patterns. However, if we include unprocessed and processed red meat, that pushes many of them into their allotted ranges. And if processed poultry is misclassified as red meat, which is often the case when we rely on food frequency questionnaire data, this pushes several of those groups beyond their allotted ranges. So these results emphasize the importance of using specific and clear meat terminology and descriptions of what foods are included in each of those categories as the dietary guidelines scientific committees called into action. So on the previous slide under method 2, I used the term total red meat, but I'm being a bit of a hypocrite there because this is not actually representative of total red meat. Estimating total red meat means that we're being inclusive of both the lean and fatty portions of the red meat that we eat. And it is a challenge estimating both the lean and fatty portions with our current USDA databases because the meat variables available in these databases are not meant for these purposes. So for this to make more sense, I need to first give you a brief overview of the USDA dietary databases for those of you who may not use it regularly. So the Food Surveys Research Group is part of the Beltsville Human Nutrition Research Center, where I work at the USDA, and they develop and manage the USDA's dietary databases, which are reflective and representative of what is consumed in the US. My favorite database of theirs is the Food Patterns Equivalence Database, which converts all foods and beverages that they have into the components that make up the dietary patterns from the dietary guidelines for Americans. So what this means is that it breaks down each food code into components like vegetables and subcomponents like green leafy vegetables or protein foods and meat. And so this database, the Food Patterns Equivalence Database, I will refer to as the FPED throughout the rest of the presentation, is used to model the food patterns that go into the dietary guideline recommendations. And there are a handful of meat variables in the FPED, which you'll see here defined on the slide. The meat variable is mostly unprocessed red meats. The cured meat variable consists of processed red meat and processed poultry. And the poultry variable is mostly unprocessed poultry products. And the unit of these meat variables is very important. These are lean ounce equivalents because the recommended dietary patterns from the dietary guidelines recommend consumption of lean meats only to limit the intake of solid fats. So going back to these results, the reason why I say this total red meat category is not actually total red meat is because this is representing total lean red meat only. And that's because this variable was created using a method that I developed while a fellow at NCI, where we disaggregated and reaggregated some of the meat-related FPEDs into alternative meat categories to ask either different or more specific questions related to meat intake. So more specifically, this variable is total lean red meat. And lean meat, or a lean meat ounce equivalent, is calculated within the FPED by first identifying any solid fat present in the meat above 2.63 grams per ounce equivalent. And then anything above that threshold is not counted in the meat variable, but is moved over to the solid fat variable, so that only the lean portion of the meat is identified and can be modeled in the recommended eating patterns. However, we don't eat just lean meat in America, and quite often we eat very fatty meats. And some age groups, such as those less than 2 years old, don't have solid fat limits, as older age groups do. So there are sometimes needs for estimating more than just the lean portion. And the current categories available in the FPED database just need a little bit of re-engineering to allow defining meat in that way. So our objective was to develop a method of estimating both the lean and non-lean components of red meat, poultry, and cured meat, and to make this method publicly available in an effort to offer a standardized method of doing this for the research community so that food pattern modeling exercises could be easily compared. I'll first give you an overview of how the method works, and then I'll break it down into further details for those of you who are less familiar with the intricacies of these databases. And I'll mostly use red meat as an example. So we first divide all meat-containing food codes in the databases into what I'm going to refer to as whole foods. So this is my definition of it. It's a food code that is only referring to meat. So it's a food code like ground beef or a hot dog. And then mixed dishes, again, this is just my definition for the sake of explanation, is a food code that contains meat within the context of a larger recipe. And so there are other food components within that recipe. For example, a hot dog might include a bun, ketchup, onions, etc. And we did this division by using the What We Eat in America food categories that group food codes based on common nutrients and common usage by Americans, which this list is also curated by the USDA's Food Service Research Group. And then we essentially just calculate total red meat by adding back the saturated fat from the, the solid fat from the solid fat variable, basically just adding that back in. So this is relatively straightforward for the whole food meat codes because any solid fat in that line of data will correspond to meat because the whole food is just meat. So for example, meat sticks as a baby food are considered a whole food code. This code contains 2.38 ounce equivalents of lean red meat from the FPED database, and that is per 100 grams of the food code. And this is represented in green. And then there is an additional weight of 0.27 ounce equivalents of solid fats. And so we just add those two numbers together to get the total red meat in that food code, which is including the lean and fatty portions. And so the total red meat amount is 2.65 ounce equivalents, and that's shown in purple. And I will reiterate that this calculation is done within the FPED database, so it is the amount of that variable per 100 grams of the parent food code. This is not done on the individual level or the participant reported dietary intake data yet. But the equations show that this is a simple proportional merge between the FPED database and the self-reported amount using NHANES in this example. So if someone reports consuming meat sticks and the lean amount from the FPED database shows us that there's 3.5 lean ounce equivalents, and that's in orange, and then proportionally the total red meat, including the solid fats, is 3.89 ounce equivalents, and that's in red. However, this gets more complicated with the mixed dishes because the solid fat weight that is on the parent food code level may correspond to multiple ingredients in that recipe. So we have to kind of unfold the recipe into the underlying components to isolate the meat-specific ingredients. So this is an example of a food code that represents a meat-containing mixed dish, and that mixed dish is pizza with extra meat, thin crust. And so we merged in the ingredient data from other USDA dietary databases for this food code. And the ingredients, along with other things, contain red meat, which is beef in the red text, poultry, which is chicken in the dark blue text, and two types of cured meat, which include pepperoni and sausage in the lighter blue text. The variables on the left are the variables that already exist in the FPED database. So these are the lean red meat, poultry, and cured meat ounce equivalents, as well as the solid fats converted into ounce equivalents. And then you'll see the new total variables are in the black box to the right. So for each meat listed as an ingredient, we added the solid fat ounce equivalents to the ounce equivalents of the corresponding meat, so within that same line of data, to create the new variables that are in the black box, which now include both lean and non-lean meat components. So for example, the weight of the ground beef, the lean meat ounce equivalents of the ground beef was 3.29 ounce equivalents, plus the additional corresponding weight of the solid fats, which is 0.23 ounce equivalents, which leads to a total red meat ounce equivalents of 3.52 per 100 grams of that pizza food code. And then that math is performed in the same way for the chicken, the sausage, and the pepperoni. And then the new variables in the black box, the total red meat, total poultry, and total cured meat, are then summed so that this parent food code now contains these additional FPED aligned meat variables representing both lean and non-lean portions of red meat, poultry, and cured meat. Then the same proportional equation is applied when merging into participant-reported dietary intake data, such as NHANES. So as I said with the first example using the meat sticks as the baby food, this first part is completed within the FPED database, so the amounts are based on 100 gram serving of each food code, so 100 grams of pizza with extra meat and a thin crust. And each ingredient that I showed in the prior slide is reweighted and recalculated so that it is proportional to 100 grams of each food code. It's kind of complicated, but I'm happy to answer questions about that later. And so when you're merging in the participant data, those amounts need to proportionally reflect the amount that the participant reported consuming. So in this case, this participant from NHANES reported eating 450 grams of this pizza. So all these numbers are essentially multiplied by 4.5 to reflect the amount reported by the participant. And so I kept the same color coding scheme here because I know it's really hard to follow these equations sometimes, but let's look at the red meat variable again in this example. So in the FPED database, there is 0.23 ounce equivalents of lean red meat per 100 grams of pizza, and that's in green. And after adding in the amount of solid fat that was corresponding to the red meat, the amount of total red meat present in 100 grams of pizza with extra meat is 0.29 ounce equivalents in purple. And then the participant reported 450 grams of pizza, which is proportional to 1.04 ounce equivalents of lean red meat in orange, which is then proportional to 1.13 ounce equivalents of red meat in red. So, wow, thank you for bearing with me for all of those equations and the nitty-gritty details of the database. It is pretty intricate to explain. So now let's get to the fun part. So after applying that method to the What We Eat in America NHANES data, which is the dietary intake portion of the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, I'm using the 17-18 data cycle here for individuals aged greater than 2 years old. We can compare the estimates of lean and total red meat, poultry, and cured meat that we just created using the method that I showed you. So in this graph, you'll see ounce equivalents on the y-axis. Red meat is in red, cured meat is in light blue, and poultry is in dark blue, with the solid bar representing the lean ounce equivalents, or the original FPED variables, and the striped bar representing the newly created variables, which incorporates both lean and non-lean components, so it's total red meat, total cured meat, and total poultry. And the differences from the graph seem trivial at first, and the delta is shown in the table. And again, it seems small because it's on an ounce equivalent scale. And so, for example, the mean intake of lean red meat for the US population on any given day is 1.5 ounce equivalents, and total red meat, including the non-lean portion, is 1.6 ounce equivalents per day. So a difference of only 1/10 of an ounce. But if you put that in perspective of grams of solid fat, by estimating total rather than just the lean portion, you are including an additional 4 grams of solid fat for red meat, an additional 1 grams of solid fat for poultry, and an additional 5 grams of solid fat for cured meat, which makes up about 10 grams of solid fat consumed on any given day at the population level when estimating lean and non-lean portions of meat intake. In conclusion, we developed a method of assessing total red meat, total poultry, and total cured meat which incorporates the solid fat weight in addition to the lean meat ounce equivalents of the original FPED variables. And we are working on some sensitivity analyses to just assess the robustness of the method, because anything you do with dietary data does have some assumptions. And once we have completed this, we will make this method publicly available in an effort to standardize this methodology for the research community. And this will be available on the National Cancer Institute website, where our current method for estimating intakes of processed red meat and processed poultry are. So this is just kind of a continuation of that research. And on the public health level, it is important to consider lean and non-lean portions of meat intake, because choosing lean red meat, poultry, and cured meat can help Americans reduce consumption of about 10 grams of solid fat daily. I want to thank my collaborators, Kelly Higgins and Kirsten Herrick, and I'd also like to extend a thank you to Jill Reedy, Alana Moshfegh, and Shanti Bowman, who have provided input at the early stages of developing this method. And I'm really looking forward to answering questions at the question and answer session. Thank you so much for listening, and please feel free to contact me if you have any other questions.
Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Julie Hess of the USDA ARS Grand Forks Human Nutrition Research Center, and I'll be presenting my recent work entitled Modeling Dairy-Free, Vegetarian, and Vegan USDA Food Patterns. I'll kick things off today with some background information about the Dietary Guidelines for Americans. The most recent iteration of the Dietary Guidelines for Americans came out in 2020. The Dietary Guidelines are often referred to by just DGA, and the DGA is intended to provide nutrition information to promote health and prevent disease for all healthy Americans and for those Americans at risk for diet-related chronic conditions and diseases like cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, and obesity. Notably, it's not intended to treat those chronic diseases. The DGA recommends 3 dietary patterns for healthy Americans, and these dietary patterns are also referred to sometimes as the USDA food patterns, thus the title of this presentation. And these dietary patterns include the healthy US-style dietary pattern, the healthy Mediterranean-style dietary pattern, and a healthy vegetarian dietary pattern. And these dietary patterns are all developed with a process called food pattern modeling. So today, of course, we'll be focusing on the healthy vegetarian dietary pattern. And this dietary pattern, as it's written in the dietary guidelines, is a lacto-ovo-vegetarian pattern, which means it includes both eggs and dairy foods. But we know that not all vegetarians eat eggs and dairy foods. But knowing that the DGA are intended to provide recommendations for nutritious diets for all healthy Americans, which still includes those vegetarians who may avoid dairy foods and/or eggs, the purpose of this study was to assess whether the healthy vegetarian dietary pattern in the DGA could be adapted for dairy-free vegetarian, or ovo-vegetarian, and vegan diets, that is diets with no animal products, while still providing adequate nutrition for healthy adults consuming a 2,000-calorie diet. So to do this, we first looked at the healthy vegetarian dietary pattern from the 2020 DGA and identified the food groups that would need to be substituted for either an ovo-vegetarian or a vegan eating pattern. And of course, that would be the dairy group and the eggs group. So how best to replace dairy foods and eggs in this dietary pattern? Well, the dairy group in the DGA includes soy milk and soy yogurt fortified with calcium, vitamin A, and vitamin D. So we created a new alternative dairy group profile, which we called the Dairy Alt group, that includes only the 2 soy alternatives to dairy foods already recognized in the DGA. The nutrient profile of some select nutrients can be seen on this page. So the number you see underneath the Dairy Alt composite title refers to the food codes from USDA's Food Data Central database that were used to create this profile. And all nutrients with start amounts in the composite, in that Dairy Alt composite, reflect only data from soy milk, as data on those nutrients was not available in Food Data Central for soy yogurt. Of course, eggs are a protein food, a subgroup of the protein foods group, and at the 2,000 calorie healthy vegetarian dietary pattern, 3 ounce equivalents of eggs a week are recommended. So for the vegan pattern, the eggs were replaced with equivalent amounts of 3 plant-based protein foods. So that would be beans, peas, and lentils, soy products, and nuts and seeds. So this is what the original healthy vegetarian dietary pattern from the DGA at the 2000 calorie level looks like next to our adaptations for an ovo-vegetarian diet and for a vegan diet. So if you look about halfway down the table where those red outlines are, you'll see that the dairy group has been replaced with the dairy alt group for both the ovo-vegetarian and the vegan pattern. And in the vegan pattern, the egg servings were removed and replaced with an extra ounce equivalent each per week of beans, peas, and lentils, soy products, and nuts and seeds. But none of the other groups have changed at all, including the discretionary calories for treats and solid fats. So we're about to dive into the results section, which will cover how changes to the amounts of different food groups affected the nutrient profiles of these different patterns. But before I do that, I would be remiss not to mention where these nutrient values come from. So the nutrient information for all of the food groups and subgroups listed here, of course, with the exception of the dairy alt group that was developed by our research team, these come from the Food Pattern Modeling Report of the 2020 Dietary Guidelines for Americans. So I mentioned at the beginning that these food patterns in the dietary guidelines are created with a process called food pattern modeling. And for our study, we adapted this food pattern modeling methodology slightly to create an ovo-vegetarian adaptation and a vegan adaptation. When eggs and dairy foods are removed from the original healthy vegetarian dietary pattern and replaced with other items, and we looked at the resulting nutrient profiles of these patterns, what do we find? So for the purposes of these comparisons, we looked at differences in nutrients relative to both the original 2000 calorie healthy vegetarian dietary pattern, which I'll cover in this slide and the next slide, and the differences based on the dietary reference intakes for those groups of individuals for whom a 2000 calorie diet may be appropriate, according to the 2020 DGA. And that's females 19 to 30 years and males 51 years or older. So we'll cover these differences in results slides 3 and 4. But for these first two slides that compare the ovo-vegetarian and the vegan adaptations to the original healthy vegetarian dietary pattern, we focus on difference between 10 to 20% and greater than 20%, an approach that's been taken by previous publications on this topic. So talking first through the macronutrient differences, energy increased slightly with both the ovo-vegetarian adaptation and the vegan adaptation. Fat increased by about 13 to 15% in both of these models too, and protein decreased by about 10% in both of these models. But carbohydrates, fiber, and saturated fat changed less than 10%. Comparing the vegan and ovo-vegetarian adaptations with the healthy vegetarian dietary pattern in terms of micronutrients and other dietary components, some increased like iron, some B vitamins, vitamin K, copper, vitamin D, and vitamin B12. Zinc, sodium, phosphorus, and cholesterol all decreased, and choline increased only in the ovo-vegetarian model due to eggs being retained in that model. And several other nutrient levels changed very minimally, if at all. That includes calcium, potassium, vitamin A, and vitamin B6. Both the ovo-vegetarian and vegan models contain adequate nutrition to meet the dietary reference intakes for most age and sex groups for whom a 2000 calorie diet may be appropriate. So according to the DGA, like I mentioned before, a 2000 calorie diet may be appropriate for both females 19 to 30 years of age and males 51 years of age or older. So this slide covers the adequacy of the modeled ovo-vegetarian and vegan diets in terms of DRIs for females 19 to 30 years. So for most nutrients, both the ovo-vegetarian and vegan models contain adequate amounts to meet the DRIs for females 19 to 30 years, with a few exceptions that are noted on this slide. But these amounts, sodium, vitamin E, vitamin D, and choline, were also low in the original healthy vegetarian dietary pattern. In fact, the amounts of these nutrients were actually higher in the modeled ovo-vegetarian and vegan patterns than in the original lacto-ovo-vegetarian pattern in the DGA, with the exception of sodium. Sodium is generally more of a concern for excessive intake in the US rather than insufficient intake, as the average consumption is around 3,400 milligrams per day, while 2,300 milligrams per day is the recommendation for most of the healthy adult population. The results are similar here for males 51 years and older with the addition of zinc. So zinc is the only nutrient that was below the DRI for adult males 51 years and older that was not provided in insufficient amounts in the healthy vegetarian dietary pattern. So only a little over 50% of the zinc recommendations were provided by our ovo-vegetarian and vegan models. So of course there are limitations to the ovo-vegetarian and vegan adaptations to the healthy vegetarian dietary pattern. So the current patterns in the dietary guidelines, like I mentioned before, are developed via food pattern modeling. and food pattern modeling depends on choosing the most nutrient-dense representative foods to create a nutrient profile for each food group. So we talked about the dairy group on a previous slide, and that's a composite of 49.6% milk, 44.8% cheese, and 1% soy milk, all represented by their most nutrient-dense forms. So for milk, for example, that's going to be fat-free milk. In the dairy alt group that we created, we replaced all of those foods with soy milk and soy yogurt. So because we replaced all of the dairy-containing options with soy alternatives, this means that this food group, this dairy alt group, no longer represents the actual dairy intake of Americans. Soy milk is the basis of our dairy alternative group, but we know that only about 1% of the dairy servings consumed by Americans are soy milk, and we don't even have that data for soy yogurt intake at this time. So in addition, I'll talk through this on the next slide a bit too, we also don't have data on how vegetarian Americans actually eat, which means that both the DGA model, that original healthy vegetarian dietary pattern, and our adaptations to the healthy vegetarian dietary patterns, the ovo-vegetarian and the vegan patterns, are still based on how most Americans eat, and we know that most Americans are not vegetarian. So we know that these actually aren't representative of how vegetarian Americans eat because we don't know how vegetarian Americans eat. And finally, because understanding dietary components outside of nutrients is an emerging area of research, we also don't fully understand the potential ramifications to the choice of removing animal foods from the diet. So the health and nutrition impacts of replacing foods such as traditional dairy foods and eggs in vegetarian diets can't be fully anticipated with food pattern modeling. Now, we haven't had the chance in this presentation to talk extensively through a list of nutrients that were covered or not covered in the study, but another limitation worth mentioning is that iodine is not included in our food pattern model adaptations. This group surely knows that iodine is not a nutrient available in the food composition databases used to develop the food pattern modeling report in the 2020 DGA, which means that it also wasn't available to us in developing our ovo-vegetarian and vegan adaptations. But with the backdrop of these limitations and in the parameters specified, we did find that it's possible to adapt the healthy vegetarian dietary pattern to be ovo-vegetarian or vegan and retain levels of nutrients comparable to or better than the original healthy vegetarian dietary pattern, with the exception of zinc for males 51 years and older. So this study had some surprising results. Even the DGA acknowledges that diets with more limited amounts of animal foods may be at risk for lower amounts of certain essential nutrients like calcium, protein, vitamin B12, and choline. In addition, this study also shows that it's possible for Americans to replace dairy foods with the dairy alternatives in the DGA and still obtain the same nutrients. Of course, the bioavailability of those nutrients and the bioactives is another matter, but the nutrients themselves are there in the soy milk and soy yogurt in Food Data Central. And this is good news for Americans with dairy allergies or sensitivities like lactose intolerance who may not care for lactose-free dairy products. Yet it's still a bit challenging to grasp the significance of this study in the greater context of American diets, since we don't actually have that much information and that much recent information on how many Americans follow vegetarian diets of any kind. So in short, we can provide these adaptations, but we don't have a firm grasp on how big the group is that may be wanting or needing them. However, we do know that there is a great deal of interest in plant-based eating and increasing sales of plant-based foods. For this study, we looked at Google Trends data to provide some context, and we found that interest in both of those terms, plant-based eating, plant-based foods, has been steadily increasing in the US for the last 10 years. So with this backdrop, it's impossible to know how seekers of this information are defining plant-based and its relationship with vegan or vegetarian diets, as they can be used interchangeably, or if those searching for veganism or plant-based eating patterns are looking at a temporary diet, a recipe or two, or a new lifestyle altogether. So I have on the slide here that anywhere from 2 to 6% of Americans may be vegetarian, and that's according to the best estimates we have, which are either from studies that were conducted several years ago or were not rigorously conducted. So NHANES data from 2007 to 2010 indicated that approximately 2.1% of Americans self-identified as vegetarian, and of that 2.1%, only 3% reported consuming no animal protein foods. The Vegetarian Resource Group provides more recent estimates of the numbers of Americans who follow vegetarian or vegan diets based on their simple online survey. The Vegetarian Resource Group's 2020 survey indicates that about 6% of American adults are vegetarian and 3% of American adults are vegan. We do know that incorporating eating patterns or showing how eating patterns can be adopted for a wider range of Americans whose nutrition recommendations come from the DGA, and again, that's all healthy Americans or those at risk of a chronic disease, would still be a beneficial add to future iterations of the dietary guidelines. And with that, I'd like to say thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.